This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook, Tim, and Super Inframan. Thank you so very much. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I have on with me Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. How are you two doing?
We're fine, and we're really raring to go on your show.
Yes, we're very well. So yeah, like I said, raring to go.
Bring it on.
You have this great new book out called When God Had a Wife, the fall and rise of the sacred feminine in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And this is out on Inner Traditions earlier this year?
Yeah.
Actually, it was just before Christmas it came out.
Okay.
But,
and do you want to tell people real quickly a little bit about your history?
It goes back a very long way, actually, our history, because we've known each other for 30 years, and we've been writing books together for about 25. About 25, yeah. Basically, we write about religious and historical mysteries. I mean, non-fiction. Right. We delve into various things. We've done books about the Second World War, for example. You know, we've written about the royal family. We've written about, but most of all, I think our big thing is the history of Christianity, the real history of Christianity, as opposed to the one that the church puts forward. So that's basically, what we're about. But during the course of that, we wrote a book called The Templar Revelation, which came out in 1997, and which a certain American fiction writer called Dan Brown picked up in a bookstore one day, thought that looks interesting, and read our first chapter, which was entitled The Secret Code of Leonardo da Vinci, and he got an idea.
And in some ways, this new book, it's kind of actually a prequel to the Templar Revelation, because in that we delved into, we started off looking at kind of esoteric and heretical traditions in European history, which led us back to the first century and what went on with the beginnings of Christianity, with Jesus and so on. And we said quite a lot of things in that, but this goes further back, and so it's the kind of prequel to it. Yeah. Actually look at, understanding the environment, the religious environment that Jesus and John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene and people were working within, their own history, their own backstory of their religion, makes sense of an awful lot of things that when you look at Christianity in the way it's normally taught in Bible school and things, a lot of things about it don't make sense. But when you understand the real history of kind of the Old Testament, suddenly it does. This is us sort of delving right back into the origins of the Judeo-Christian tradition and finding there are lots of things about it that are very different to what most people think and what we've been taught.
Yeah, this paints a very different picture of the whole time period. You kind of you start out kind of reconstructing Jewish history and seeing what's missing from the very early writings.
That's right, and how that religion took shape, and what it was to start with. I mean, the title of the book, When God Had a Wife, may be a clue as to some of the things that are in there.
Just a bit, yeah.
But essentially what we found was that, and actually it's one of the remarkable things about doing this research, although it kind of sounds very way out there and very kind of fringe and very alternative, a huge amount of this actually comes from real academic scholarship that's been done by proper bona fide professors of this and that, what we've really done is look at all these things that they say and put them all together in one place and join the dots. And that's when the story really begins to change. Because essentially what we found is that the Judaic religion as we know it was sort of put together much more recently than people think. About mid sort of 3rd, 4th century before Jesus. That's when they codified the religion, and in the process of it changed it quite drastically, which also meant rewriting their history, going all the way back to Moses and beyond. That is very different. The big thing, as you guess from the title, is that in the original Israelite religion, they had a goddess. Well, goddesses, plural, but one goddess in particular, who was regarded as Yahweh or Jehovah's wife.
Yep. And she was even worshipped beside him in Solomon's temple. For 2/3 of the time, the temple was there. So, this is already significantly different from what people have been led to believe, that that the whole worshipping other gods for a start, let alone goddesses, was absolutely forbidden. Well, no, it wasn't, and in fact, it was actually even authorized. So, this is astonishing, isn't it? I mean, we were astonished. We were astonished.
It's kind of mind blowing, honestly. Yeah. And you have archaeological support for a lot of this too.
Well, yes. I mean, one of the sort of sweet things that we came across, that in the 20th century, the archaeological digs were turning up all sorts of interesting stuff that backed up the idea of the Israelite goddess. And what one dig found some broken pot shards that had inscribed on them a blessing. And it was a blessing on somebody who'd lived in around there, in that time. But the blessing was in the name of Yahweh and his Asherah, and Asherah was the name of his wife. So I think that's rather sweet, in the name of Yahweh and his Asherah. You think, but there it was, and it's not the only such thing to be found. So there she is. Asherah, the great goddess, the great Israelite mother goddess, and she just seemed to have fallen off a cliff historically.
Now, one of the things you talk about early on that I also found very interesting is you talk about how we have all these stories from the Old Testament about what happened, and they're in this grandiose scale. And you say a lot of biblical scholars and archaeologists, well, this never happened. But you're looking at it and saying, well, it did happen. It just didn't happen on the scale that it was talked about in the Bible. Like they've exaggerated these stories into something grandiose where they were actually happening on a much smaller scale.
That's right. I think it's just a human characteristic that when people tell stories, and particularly tell stories about their history and their past and their culture, they exaggerate. I mean, I think every period of history does. And the writers of the Old Testament books did it on, I was just going to say on a biblical scale, but that's quite different. So that when you read of, there's a battle in which so many tens of thousands of people took place and were killed. No, they're just exaggerating, just bring the figures down quite a lot. And one particular period of history is the period of, when the Israelites came into the Promised Land and basically invaded it. The figures they talk about there, you have these huge battles that, and huge territories and huge cities. And when archaeologists went looking for evidence of this, they just couldn't find it, which led a lot of historians and archaeologists basically to say all the really old stuff in the Old Testament, the Exodus, Moses, and so on, and the conquest of the Promised Land, is just fiction. It's just made up. But when you actually do look at the history of what has been found, actually the archaeology does support the story, but say just on a very, very much smaller scale, much smaller communities. What they kind of talk about in the Old Testament books as being a city was actually a small town. You actually look at the dimensions, say, of Solomon's temple, which we have in our mind as being this huge kind of cathedral-like building. You actually even look at the measurements that are given in the Old Testament itself, and it's just kind of the size of a town church. So, and once you realise that, once you scale everything back in that way, not only does it start to make more sense and become more reasonable, a lot of the objections that some people have to the history and saying it was just all invention. It's suddenly, all those objections disappear. And suddenly the story in the Old Testament is basically true, just massively exaggerated.
Yeah.
And then manipulated for when they really sat down and established the religion and decided exactly what they believed and what their history was, they kind of wrote lots of things out. Just as an example, Lynn mentioned earlier that this goddess Asherah in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, that's actually there in the Old Testament books. It's in a way not hidden, but it's portrayed as being something that people did when they lost faith in God. They went backwards and reverted to old sort of pagan religions. So these things are acknowledged actually in the Old Testament itself. It's just they're turned around and said, well, this is when they did some backsliding and turned turned into heretics. So it's not actually denied. So the events aren't denied. It's just that's spun. Again, another very great human characteristic.
Well, yeah. I mean, as Clive said, they presented, Asherah, she was worshipped, in the temple, but it just shows you how wicked they'd become that are even worshipping something like Asherah, when in fact the truth is that she was actually officially part of the religion. So, I mean, that was the ultimate spin, that was actually shocking.
And you even mentioned here that the walls of Jericho had actually fallen archaeologically long before the claims that the ark, it was the ark that took down the walls in the Bible.
Blowing the trumpets and doing all this and
stumping.
Because at the time, I can't remember exactly when it was, but when they archaeologists first went to Jericho and found evidence that the walls had been cast down and everything, there was this, this is proof of the Bible story.
Right.
But then they did some dating and realized it was several hundred years too soon for that. It just didn't work. And then they actually found evidence that it was the Egyptian army that caused that, that in that particular battle that did it.
That's embarrassing.
It was a bit embarrassing. So they had to go, and there was this backtracking that they went to the other extreme and said, well, the ancient Israelites kind of never existed. Yeah. But
yes, because I remember the absolute shock. I mean, many, many years ago, I went into the British Museum and asked one of the museum assistant people. I said, where's the room with the the stuff about the Exodus from Egypt? And they looked pityingly at me and said, "There's no evidence whatsoever they were ever there, madam." And that was many years ago. And that was a real moment when I just thought, oh, okay, what is all this Bible stuff, But I mean, there still isn't any archaeological evidence for the Exodus, or in fact, there have been so many, Israelites enslaved in Egypt. But something was going on there, and there is a great Egyptian connection with Israelite history. It's just that, it's very hard to unpick exactly what it was.
Yeah, you say there's an Egyptian source for a lot of the stories, of course the Ark, but even up to including circumcision, all kind of comes from Egypt.
Yeah. There's lots of Egyptian traces, because it's another thing that the more skeptical historians say, well, the whole connection with Egypt, the whole Exodus thing is just storytelling. But again, the clues are there, both in certain bits of archaeology, but also within the text. As you mentioned, the Ark of the Covenant, which seems to be based on an Egyptian model. There are lots of Egyptian names in the early stories, Moses being the obvious one, but some are less obvious. Some of the early, particularly associated with the early priests in the story. There's Phineas, who's priest, which is the first hereditary high priest. Now, his name is Egyptian. And then you start to think, well, if these stories are just entirely made up, why do they use Egyptian names, which they clearly had forgotten by their own time that they were of Egyptian origin? Even people like Miriam, Moses' sister, the first prophetess, that comes from an Egyptian root. So you start getting all these little clues in the language, in the religion, in the names, that actually there was an Egyptian connection, but it is not as straightforward as the entire load of Israelites all coming in from Egypt, wandering around for 40 years, invading the Promised Land and taking it over completely. It's a little more complicated than that, but there is an Egyptian core to the religion. Many elements of the religion as described in the Old Testament aren't really don't really connect with that region, but they have very strong resonances with ancient Egyptian religious concepts. So there's a core of truth to it all. Once you start to unpick it, as say lots of historians and scholars have done, you actually get a much more convincing picture comes out than the one you actually read in the Bible. Yeah,
and as Clive said, and you said, Seriah, the Ark of the Covenant, the physical Ark, it does sound very much like, for example, the carrying chest that was found in King Tutankhamun's tomb.
Yeah.
With the long poles on either side, and the rings to carry it. The ark itself was not invented by God for the Israelites, very probably. I think that we can conclude that it does have Egyptian resonances, certainly.
And you even say that Akhenaten might have been part of the influence for the monotheistic model that they tried to impose over time.
Well, this is one of the things, and it's one of the things that will surprise most listeners and most people that come into this, is that if you look at what Old Testament scholars and historians of the religion as they understand it now, they don't think that, in fact, it's certain that the early Israelites were not monotheists. Now, that is like a huge thing, given the way we've all been brought up to think about the Judaic religion and then the Christian religion that came from it. To say it was not monotheistic seems sort of quite perverse almost. But the thing is, they weren't monotheists. What they were is a thing called monolaters. And monolatry is not the same as being a monotheist. Being a monolater is where you worship one particular god out of a pantheon of gods. So you make them the top ones, but you still acknowledge the fact that other gods exist. It's just you've kind of done a deal with this particular one who is your people's protector. And it was actually quite a common thing in the ancient world. So, and when you actually read the Old Testament books, the early books, they don't even try and hide this fact. They don't say that there is only one God. They say there is only one God that we worship specially. So you get phrases like When the prophetess Miriam says to God, "Who among the gods is like you?" She doesn't say you're the only God. The first commandment is you shall have no other gods before me. Not saying there aren't any others. It's not until you get much, much later into the prophet Isaiah in that book, that's the first time where you get a statement that not only is this our God, there are no others. And this all happens quite late. And for all that time, the Israelites are so they're worshipping one particular God, Yahweh or Jehovah, but they acknowledge the presence of other gods alongside him, and particularly a goddess, Asherah, because it was unthinkable in the ancient world that you just have one single male god. They were always paired with a goddess, who is worshipped alongside as kind of, as a couple, equal. So when you go back into the Egyptian influence, it's much more nuanced and complicated than just they've taken one god out of there. There's a whole lot of other concepts going on, and it's there's really no doubt that before a little bit after the return from the exile in Babylon, that the Israelites were monolaters. Their whole history of the Old Testament is them gradually becoming more and more fixed on this one God, until they get to a stage where actually saying, well, there aren't any anyway. We're not going to acknowledge any others at all. And that's when Asherah in particular is written out of the religion. But we argue in the book that, yes, she's written out of the official temple cult, but she survived underground.
But if they had looked to Akhenaten for as a model, Akhenaten, the heretic Egyptian king who got rid overnight, virtually got rid of all their beloved gods and goddesses and just imposed one, which was called the Aten, which was the sun disk, which only basically, came to him and his family, but he was the representative of the Aten on Earth, so he was the Aten in a sense, and basically, so it was the most appalling thing to the average Egyptian. It was dreadful. He just with force imposed his new one god on people who were polytheists to their very fingertips, and who suddenly they didn't have any goddesses apart from not having other gods. They didn't have any goddesses. They didn't have the sacred feminine in their lives. They didn't have anything that they had built their entire spiritual lives on. And anyway, when Akhenaten died, basically, everything went back to the way it had been before him. It was as if he had not existed. His images were smashed. His son, that was Tutankhamun, reinstated the old religions. So actually, that is a cautionary tale to anybody who was thinking of imposing monotheism. It's look what happens when you do.
Yeah. So as we get into this Hebrew goddess of Asherah, you draw a connection to, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, but is it Kudshu?
Kudshu. Actually, we don't know if he's saying it right.
We don't know.
This is the problem, doing most of your learning through books. And also the problem with these, particularly the Hebrew language or alphabet doesn't have vowels, so everyone's guessing how people said these things. Yeah. So Kudshu will do. Yeah. There's a variation which I think we prefer only because it's easier to say, which is Kadesh. Which is a variation of it, which is as I think most people will know, that when in the ancient peoples talked about gods and goddesses, they could be very fluid in how they compared and paired them up, and that for example, one goddess would have different aspects depending what side of herself she's expressing. So this Kadesh is Asherah. This is her in her kind of sexy mode. This is when she's a fertility goddess. This is when she's very sexual and erotic. Asherah in the normal way of worship was actually quite motherly. You know, she was their great mother.
Or even grandmotherly.
Oh, yes. And great. Sometimes matronly, but she had her sexy side too, and Kadesh is that, and that becomes quite a big clue to certain stories in the Bible, makes other connections with Egyptian goddesses and other Canaanite goddesses, because you can follow these trails of the titles that they give different deities. And it's actually, it's something that always it is a great example of the rewriting of history, because this word Kadesh, it literally just means holy. And you find in modern translations, English translations of the Bible, you come across this phrase when it's talking about the temple, and when it's actually saying how the people had allowed other gods and goddesses into it, and they were turning away from the Lord, etc. And you come up with this word that in the temple there were what they call cult prostitutes. And you start to look into this word, think, well, what on earth is this doing in here? And you actually look at the Hebrew word, and the word is Kadeshah. And Kadeshah literally means holy ones. That's all it means. So when you translate that into English, you should translate it as the holy women, but somehow it's become sacred prostitutes. Now, how did that happen? And what happened was, because when they codified the religion, in the late centuries BC, to kind of demonize the goddess, they used lots of kind of negative sexual metaphors, so worshipping her was like visiting a prostitute. It was like committing adultery. And because they kept using this imagery, it stuck to the point that, a modern translator looking at this word that says, well, look at the word holy women and translate it as prostitute. That's how the process happened.
It was ever thus, and and the goddesses, priestesses, would automatically be seen as prostitutes in the eyes of the very largely male academics. Must be said.
So it's one of those stories, and what we believe, or what comes across very clearly when you translate the thing properly, when you have holy women worshipping Asherah in the temple, it means she had her priestesses there. She had her own priestesshood, which is exactly what you'd expect. But instead, they've been turned into the prostitutes that hang around the temple. Which is just one of the most sort of telling things of how that story is rewritten.
Now, you talking here about Ruth Hestern and her discovery and how it kind of got dismissed initially.
Yes. This is one. It's one of the kind of links in the pieces in the jigsaw that scholars have made during the last, I suppose, 30 years. It's actually quite a hard one to explain on air, because it's mainly visual. It's to do with images. But essentially, Ruth Hestern, who's the curator at the museum in Jerusalem, had put together sort of Canaanite imagery to do with the goddess Asherah, because the Canaanites worshipped her too. Together with Israelite images that related to a tree being nibbled at by goats. It's sort of a quite complex thing. And she realized that when you put these sort of various images together, it shows that images that had been acknowledged for a long time in the archaeology of the Israelites were actually images relating to Asherah, because it didn't have this inscription on them. It just had this image of the tree with goats and things. No one quite knew what it all meant. But when Ruth Hestern put all these chain of images together, suddenly realised that this Israelite images relating to Asherah, and it was a big part of putting this jigsaw together with all kinds of other clues that have made scholars realise that there was this Asherah, together with the inscriptions that Lynn talked about. That this huge amount of evidence when you see it for what it is that points to the significance of the worship of Asherah,
and the fact it was more widespread than was thought.
And so that was an important clue. But it was, and now everyone kind of acknowledges that this is right, but they kind of tend not to attribute it to Ruth Hestern for some reason. That whole assembly of images, all these little clues that are put together, and this big story emerges from it. Yeah,
because now when archaeologists find a pot, say, that has a tree and goats nibbling at the leaves, it's likely to be a reference to Asherah, not just a pretty rural scene.
Right. Right. And the fact that they sort of don't attribute it to Ruth is interesting, but you see that especially with anyone who's overturning a paradigm, like the person who initially comes up with it often doesn't get the credit.
Tell us about it. Yeah. Oh yes. We could talk a very long time about that. But it's true. Yeah, that happens unfortunately an awful lot.
Do you think that's just because they don't want to acknowledge someone who's not official in their eyes?
Very much so. Because although Ruth Hestern has certainly had this position in as a curator in a museum, she was by no means outside of the fold, but she wasn't an academic in the usual sense. And what happened? She'd put all this stuff together. And was trying to get it published, and none of the sort of archaeological journals would publish it until there's one of the leading archaeologists in this whole field of what we've been talking about, a guy called William Dever, who has done a lot of work on the Asherah inscriptions and the history there, and he's extremely open-minded. And very kind of generous in his approach to things. It was when Ruth Hestern got to him, and he looked at this stuff and said, "Well, this is important." He managed to get the paper published in an archaeological journal, which she'd been trying to do for a while, but it needed his kind of support to do it. So it was published. It was published under her name. It's now part of the accepted collection of data. But it's still, people tend not to actually attribute it back to her anymore, which is, annoying, but as you said, typical. But the most important thing is that the information is now out there and it's now accepted by that discipline.
Yes, because it was a kind of landmark thing, wasn't it? It was a bridge. So,
Now you have, as you go on in history, Asherah continues regardless of this monotheistic push from the church. And also you see the role of women hidden into the writings, like with wise women and stuff like that. And it's kind of, it's still there, but it's not obvious.
Yeah, again, it's in a way not, I'm going to say not hidden. It's kind of there but covered up, so it's hidden in that sense. But you do read in the Old Testament books, prophetesses, this whole tradition of wise women, Deborah being the big one, there was a phrase called a mother in Israel that puzzled people, has always puzzled people, and it's only recently that people have put all the clues together and realised this is a kind of a title of these wise women. Going back to what I was saying earlier about this translation of Kadesha, and changing a holy woman into a prostitute, there's another good example of that with the prophetess Deborah, who was an important figure in the Old Testament books. during the period of the judges. She's described in, there's a phrase that describes, which is translated as Deborah, wife of Lapidoth. Wife of Lapidoth, who's never, assumed to be her husband, who's never ever mentioned in the story. And you look at it and you think, well, wife, in Hebrew, wife and woman is the same word. Lapidoth actually means torches of fire. So you can actually translate this, instead of wife of somebody you never heard of, you can actually translate it as woman of fire, which changes it.
Yeah, it
changes your image of her somewhat.
Yeah. But I mean, it's interesting that you see Asherah had a title which was Lion Lady. So that would fit with woman of fire, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But also the other thing about these priestesses essentially hidden in plain sight in the Old Testament, the prophetesses and the wise women, they had actually immense power for women. I mean, they could hand out advice to the leaders, the top leaders, who felt compelled to listen to them. It was obviously some kind of tradition that was hallowed by the ages. And also they even advised on warfare. So, these women were quite something, even though, you really have to read between the lines sometimes to see it. But it's there in the Old Testament. They had immense power.
So when they started rewriting history, this was with the second law that they started really trying to scrub out the goddess?
Yes, it's when the book of Deuteronomy, the second law, which was the story behind it is that it was a book that had been written by Moses, but it had been lost. It had been forgotten. Not just lost, forgotten. It even existed. And one day when they were doing some repairs in the temple in Jerusalem, this is somewhere around like 621 BC, I think it is, somewhere around there. Anyway, they're doing this renovation work, and they suddenly find this book that's hidden there. And they look at it and say, it's this whole other book of Moses. It's the one that gives all the different laws about what you can and can't do. It expands the 10 Commandments to 600, I think. And they sort of look at this book and say, well, there's all these other laws that Moses wrote down and we didn't know about it and we've forgotten about it. We'd better get back to this. And they take it to the king of the time, and the king says, oh dear, we've been getting it wrong. Let's do what's in this book. Now, because if we're being cynical, and we are, this story is actually, this discovery is an invention by the priesthood, who have now become very, very strict or fixated on Yahweh as the one God. They're still not monotheists at this point. They still acknowledge the one, but they're becoming more and more centered on this one God. What's happening is that bad things are happening to Jerusalem, to the Israelites generally, and their logic is, well, we've made this deal with this one God. He's going to protect us. He's going to make things good for us. But now we're being invaded. Now we're suffering. Obviously, something's gone wrong. It's not going to be God's fault, because gods don't do that. It must be our fault. We're not worshipping him hard enough. So let's worship him more. Then some other bad things happen. They get carried off into captivity in Babylon. And I think, well, it's not going to be God's fault. It must be ours. We're still not worshipping him enough. So they gradually become more and more fixated on this one God, to eventually realize we've got to get rid of all the others, and just worship on him exclusively, rewrite the religion. And the discovery of this book of Deuteronomy is a big part of that process. It kind of starts the process. It doesn't end it. It doesn't end for another couple of 100 years. But this is certainly part of it. We've discovered a whole lot of other new laws and a whole lot of other things about God that we didn't know. And it's a fairly transparent and it's interesting, isn't it, that when the boys basically sat down and wrote out the rules, that one of the first things to go was the goddess. Get rid of the wife,
Get rid of his wife. She's very annoying. And we don't want any of the priestesses, jumping around, being empowered. We don't want any of that. Get rid of them as well. Because, of course, in everyday life, having priestesses means that you have women of power. And really, so they were rewriting the religion. They were, in effect, as Clive said, they were creating their religion. And the top of the list was, we don't want any of these priestesses. We don't want any of this female religion. It has to go. So it was a calculated thing.
So what happened to the whole role of the goddess with the fall of Jerusalem?
Well, you say thinking presumably of the the carrying off into Babylon, the exile when. Yeah. I'm just saying Jerusalem's fallen a few times, just making sure
right.
about the right fall. That's the big one. That's the big one that they is the thing that tips the whole religion over. The religion of those that are carried off into captivity, which is not by no means all of the people. It's only really the elite. It's the rulers, the kings, the high priests, the generals. They're the ones that are taken off. The scribes, the literate people. I think something like 75% of the population remained. The farmers, the peasants, and so on, and they carried on the religion as before. It's those that are carried off into Babylon that have this real crisis of thinking, well, we've lost our whole city now. Our temple's been destroyed. God really must be upset. We're really not worshipping him hard enough. And it's during that period when they're in exile that you get various prophets coming along and explaining. God's told them exactly what's happened, that they need to become much more, get rid of any other type of worship at all. So that it hardens down. And when they come back from exile, and even then, it's probably like 70 or 80 years after that, when there's a period when they actually rebuild Jerusalem. And the governor of Jerusalem is a guy called Nehemiah, the high priest, a guy called Ezra. They're the ones that sit down and codify the religion and create the religion as we know it. They're the ones that put the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, as Christians call it. They're the ones that put those books together. They're the ones that make the decisions on the history. It's at that period. So, and that's when the goddess is finally written out, and a new religion starts, a new very kind of hard line. We're fixed on this one male god, and that's it. But of course, another thing that happens in history is that when things are suppressed, they don't disappear; they just go underground. So you can't have centuries and centuries of worshipping this goddess, and you're suddenly told you're not allowed to anymore. People are still going to do it. Pagan practices survived when Christianity came in Europe. People don't give up their ways; they just do it in secret, and this is what we think. And that it's still around in secret, or in different areas. There were Hebrew communities in Egypt that had been established there before the fall of Jerusalem, and they still continue with the religion as it was before. They still have a goddess worshipped alongside Yahweh, and Samaria becomes an important place in this story, because for a long time, the authority of the Jerusalem temple didn't run there. So the old religion, the old way of practicing the religion, and particularly the veneration of the goddess, survives. And then this is where it starts to come into the New Testament story, because that starts to make sense of some of the things that we'd always found about the Jesus story. because there is a very strong feminine goddessy element to that, which again most people don't realise, but it's there.
Now you also talk about the island of Elephantine in Egypt, and that there was a Hebrew community there that nobody knew about.
Well, yes, Clive just touched on it just now. In fact, it was set up, way back in the Israelite story, and it, if you like, it was practicing the original religion, and it had a goddess, and its goddess was the very scary Anat. So obviously Anat, who was a warrior goddess, a war goddess, and there were mercenaries, there were soldiers on that island. So she was absolutely perfect for them. It was obviously their choice. But she was essentially an Israelite goddess. And so she was perhaps because, as Clive said earlier, the gods and goddesses were very fluid in their attributes. She was, if you like, another version of Asherah, although she was also a goddess by herself. So you could say that that the ancient Israelites had more than one goddess. They didn't just have Asherah, they had Anat.
And just war goddess.
And you didn't mess with Anat. You did not mess with Anat, no.
And that Lynn mentioned earlier that, that the wise women of Egypt had a role in warfare. And this very much ties back to Anat. Because she's involved in the story of Deborah, the wise woman that we were talking about before. Again, it's another one of those things that people didn't really understand certain parts of the Old Testament story until they discovered this temple in Elephantine in Egypt. And then suddenly, which has Anat in the temple alongside Yahweh, then suddenly things start to make sense. Of some of the Bible stories. There's one of the judges that ruled Egypt, for example, is Shamgat. So I've got his first name. Anyway, his second name is Ben Anat, which means son of Anat. And he's a ruler of Israel at one point, and he suddenly realized, well, son of Anat, that wasn't his mother. This is a title. And he was a warrior. He was a great warrior, and he's dedicated himself to Anat. And now, when you find the Egyptian temple, suddenly you realise why. The temple of Moses.
So, as they wiped the goddess clean of their books, she still sort of stayed in there under different names, like wisdom, for example. It almost became a code word for the goddess, but people didn't realize it for a long time. Well,
Sophia, which is Greek for wisdom, was seen as a personification of female wisdom, if you like, but she was much more than that, because she was seen as living with God in a loving sort of marriage relationship. She was exalted in the form of a tree, and Asherah was actually exalted in the form of a tree in the rural areas. Sophia was seen as a cosmic principle from which the visible world had been created. So she wasn't just a little, wise old lady sitting in a corner muttering. Sophia was this very dynamic female principle, which was actually the equal of God and had been there at the very beginning of time.
And that kind of gets, the wording on that slowly gets translated out to not mean, like anything feminine eventually.
Eventually, but certainly we're talking now about 100, 200 BC, when all these concepts of Sophia come about. And as Lynn says, very much is Asherah under a new name, a slightly more acceptable one, done in such a way that if the temple priesthood say, hang on, this is a goddess, there is a kind of get out where they can say, no, it's just we're talking about God's wisdom as a personification of it. But again, that doesn't really fool anybody. And what was really interesting to us well, many things really interesting, but particularly interesting is when you come to the story of Jesus and all the kind of many mysteries about him and what he was really about. This something we've grappled with for a long time in our books is this kind of strange mix in the Jesus story of what are clearly very Jewish elements, but there are also elements that are really hard to reconcile with Judaism, what you might call pagan elements. And most sort of historians, scholars deal with it by saying, well, one part is true and the other side is something that was just laid onto the story later. But we've never found that convincing because both sides appear to be true. And then suddenly with this understanding the backstory, the hidden religion, the underground religion, starts to make sense. And it particularly comes through this image of, or this figure of Seriah, because Seriah, God's wisdom, Seriah is really important in the teachings of Jesus. And it's presented in translations of the Bible as if, again, it's just talking about the wisdom of God. You get, for example, there are phrases that literally translate that says the wisdom of God does such and such. And the figure of wisdom and Seriah is basically an entity that a female entity that God does God's will. So you get this phrase when Jesus refers to this and said, the wisdom of God did such and such. This is translated in a lot of English translations as God in his wisdom decided to do such and such, which is entirely different. The significance of Seriah in Jesus' teaching has got to the point that some scholars actually now term Jesus as Jesus Seriah. And have him, his message, he presents himself as a messenger, not of God, but of the wisdom of God, of Seriah, which is a very different way of, of looking at him. And it's another trend in scholarship over the last, 20 years, to realize actually how important this figure is. And then it starts to connect up with all kinds of other things. We need, I don't know how much time we've got, but we need to talk about Mary Magdalene. Yeah. Everyone's wondering about that. But she is presented as Seriah. She's equated with Seriah.
Well, essentially what we've been trying to do for the last 30 years is basically, look at what Jesus was actually about. What was actually informing his every move? What was behind his mission? And we've finally come to the conclusion in this book, When God Had a Wife, that basically he was trying to restore the very original, the very old Israelite religion, which had goddesses. So basically, when he talks about Sophia, he was talking about a real feminine principle, not just a vague term, So he had with him somebody who was almost certainly a priestess of Sophia, and that was Mary Magdalene.
I want to thank and give a shout out to all my Patreons who help support this show and keep it going. It really does help keep it going. And I want to particularly thank Tim, Super Inframan, Allison Cook, Patricia W., Barbara Fisher, Will Powell, Big Boy Limina, Craig Parmenter, Walker, Joanna Rojas, Maddie, David Moore, Vincent Trewell, The Great Change, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Chris Barr, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Edu Camahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Sam Sheeran, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Matthias Sunby, Dominic O'Malley, Christopher Vaughn, Riker and Stark, J. Otto Bullitt, Jose A., Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Matthew Sproul, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Gaia Quinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Chris 646, Carla Mahoney, and James Lattimore. Thank you all so very much.
Join us September 25th, 26th, and 27th for a 3-day special streaming event, Strange Realities, to push the limits of your reality. Featuring authors, academics, researchers, occultists, experiencers, podcasters, and practitioners. All presenting fresh cutting-edge material and research. Streaming live. Featuring presentations by
Brent Rains, editor of Alternate Perceptions magazine. Aaron Goulias, host of the Saucer Life podcast. David Metcalf, writer and researcher. Alan Greenfield, author of Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts. Stephanie Quick, writer and blogger. Red Pill Junkie, Fortean researcher and explorer. Tim Banal, host of Banal of America. Guy Malone, iconoclast and troublemaker. Timothy Ritter, host of Strange Familiars. Kiki Dombrowski, author and practitioner. Greg Bishop, author of Project Beta. Jenny Ashford, host of 13 O'Clock. Recluse, host of The Farm. Jack Montgomery, Folk Magic. Joshua Cutchin, author of Thieves in the Night. Reverend Michael Carter, Alien Contact Experiencer. Dr. Future, host of Future Quake. Tony Kale, author of Memphis Hoodoo. Rin Collier, occultist. Seriah Askath, host of Where Did the Road Go? John Tinney, Ghost Stalkers and Hell.
all 3 days, only $20. Tickets and info available at StrangeRealitiesConference.com. Brought to you by the Conspiranormal Podcast. Conspiranormal.com. Strange Realities.
Well, the thing about the Magdalene, well, there's an awful lot of things about Mary Magdalene, but you know, if you just look at the New Testament of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I mean, she's actually hardly in there by name. She's in there actually quite a lot, sort of anonymously, but you can piece together quite easily, commonsensically, that the Gospel writers are talking about her. And she does one incredibly important thing. But first, before we actually go into it, I have to say, you know, that you probably all know that the word Christ just means anointed one. And you look at the New Testament and you think, well, we can see the baptism by John, but where was the anointing? He must have been anointed to be called Christos, to be called Christ. Well, remember the strange tale of the woman with the alabaster jar full of incredibly expensive spikenard perfumed ointment? What was that but an anointing? And it's very interesting that the woman, obviously what she was doing was a ritual. Jesus talks about it at the time as if it's a ritual that he and she knew about, but the male disciples, Peter and all the others, had no idea what was going on. You know, but the thing is, what this woman did, and Jesus says she has come to anoint my body for the burying. In other words, she's come to mark him out for his destiny. So it's not just a little aromatherapy session. Basically, she's come to do the most incredible ritual, because what she's done is she has Christened Jesus. She has anointed him into his Christhood. And that is a huge thing. You know, her name is not even given. Jesus basically says in that little episode, and it's a very little episode in the Bible, blink and you miss it, but he says that, you know, wherever the gospel is preached, her name will be celebrated. And as I say, her name isn't even mentioned, you know, because almost certainly deliberately garbled. Certainly the men had no idea what was going on. I mean, they were saying, oh, let's sell what is this stupid woman doing? Why don't we sell this incredibly, expensive spikenard and give the money to the poor? He obviously thought they were sucking up to Jesus saying that. But Jesus actually tells them off. He says, no, she's done something brilliant. Just stop it. You don't understand. He understood, she understood. She was acting as a priestess, because if you're actually performing a ritual, you are a priest or a priestess. And while you are doing it, you have power over the person that you're doing it to. That's the whole point. You have authority in order to do it. So that's quite a big thought too. She had the authority as a priestess of what or of whom? Well, looking at all the other evidence we've accrued, that what Jesus was trying to do was to restore the very ancient Israelite religion, then basically she was a priestess of Asherah, or of Sophia, which is the same. So, right. So she was christening Jesus in the name of Asherah. I mean, that was sacred. That was big sacred work.
And you also connect some of this to the Isis and Osiris cult, saying that there's a lot of similarities between what Jesus and Mary did and the Isis Osiris stuff as well.
Yeah, this is something, going back to the earlier book, Templar Revelation, which is where we came to the conclusion in that Jesus and Mary Magdalene and in other figures, in John the Baptist, obviously very important in this story, were trying to restore the sacred feminine to the Jewish religion. But there's also all these kind of elements that are connected with Isis and Osiris. And so we kind of think, well, were they trying to form some kind of hybrid religion out of all these different things? But in doing the work we've done for When God Had a Wife, we realized that actually the Egyptian origins of the Hebrew religion is very much tied into the Egyptian religion, and this was remembered, this was recognized at the time. And when people created this this figure of Sophia, which is based on the Jewish concept of wisdom, Chokmah, but she's very much associated with Isis, because this actually happened. The great center of learning at that time was in Alexandria in Egypt, where you had scholars from all different religions and many sort of Jewish scholars and Jewish philosophers and Samaritan scholars and philosophers, all mixing together and exchanging ideas, and looking back into all their different pasts and different histories. And it seems that there was a recognition that Sophia, wisdom, Asherah essentially, and Isis were very closely connected. And some of the Jewish wisdom texts draw very obviously on Egyptian texts to Isis. And this, we think, explains something that puzzled us for a long time, of where this kind of Isis Osiris elements in what Jesus and Mary Magdalene are doing come from, because then essentially it all comes from the same religion. It's recognizing the Egyptian roots of what had been the Israelite religion, the Hebrew religion, had now become the Jewish religion, but it become that by throwing away a lot of parts that they were trying to bring back. So actually linking the whole thing to Isis makes a lot of sense in terms of the way people were thinking and exploring the origins of their own religions at that time. So it all does really fit together.
But it's difficult to overestimate the influence of the Isis religion and Isis herself as a goddess, because she went on influencing people around the Mediterranean, certainly, but also even Europeans up until about 500 AD, if not beyond. We know that her worship got as far as Paris, but with the Romans as far as London. So it was actually quite something to have Isis as your great goddess in your heart, and with the idol to worship, because she was very beautiful, but she was also very powerful, and she empowered women. And that's the important thing. But she'd gone on doing that for thousands of years. She was probably the most well-established goddess of love, sex, magic, you name it, that there was in the Mediterranean world at that time. And to link with her would be totally understandable. To present, your own offshoot, which would be the restoration of Asherah, would fit in that mold and be totally acceptable. So Isis was I mean, her influence was felt throughout European history, and it just rippled across into Judea. So basically, with the Magdalene being the priestess of Asherah, she would also have embodiments of Isis, and it would be this big thing, this female archetype, actually there within Jesus's mission.
Okay. One of my favorite parts of this book, and I loved the entire book, but was the chapter on Simon Magus. Especially fascinated me. I'd heard the name before. I knew next to nothing about him, and the more you talked about him, the more fascinated I was with him.
He's, in a way, to us, he was the key to putting a lot of this together. People that have heard of Simon Magus probably sort of know him that he was he was declared the first heretic. He turns up briefly in the Acts of the Apostles as somebody that it's shortly after the crucifixion, Jesus' apostles go into Samaria and encounter this guy who they essentially just have to put right. And he's just mentioned in passing. But then in early Christian tradition, there's lots of writings about Simon Magus, and they portray him as pretty much the devil incarnate, as the Antichrist. And, he is the big sort of bogeyman of the early church. He's the person you have to avoid. He's the person that is out to corrupt you. And that's what most people think he was, this magician, this sorcerer who used sort of black magic to try and corrupt the early Christians. When you actually go into the question of why the early church in the first couple of centuries was so scared of him, and you actually start looking at what he's supposed to have done, what he's supposed to have said, and ironically, quite a lot of what he said survives because early church writers quoted him in order to condemn what he said, and if they hadn't done that, we'd never know anything about him.
I love that.
Yeah, it's wonderfully ironic.
But and you start looking at him and you realize how much like Jesus he was. He's supposed to have done the same things, and the early writings acknowledge this. They just say he was kind of a demonic kind of
twin.
What's the word? Not twin. Sort of a parody almost. It's not a strong enough word, but
travesty.
Travesty. Yeah. So he's trying to corrupt people by doing the same things as Jesus, but he's actually doing it on behalf of the devil. But so realizing how much like Jesus he was, but the one thing that looks entirely different, the other thing that Simon Magus was famous for, was going around with a woman whose name was Helen, who was a former prostitute, according to his story. And he basically said, he's supposed to be a prostitute that he came across in a seaport, in a sailor's town, purchased her freedom, and by doing so, this is bringing salvation to people. And the reason he said that, he said, well, he has this story that at the creation of the world, it was actually Helen who was this creative power, but she was trapped in the world of matter and forced to reincarnate through various female lives, each one getting further and further degraded until she ends up as a prostitute in a sailor's town. But she's actually he explicitly says she is Seriah. She is the kind of the creative energy of God. And what's brilliant about what he's done, I said earlier about this turning of the priestess into a prostitute. So the process that went through in the Old Testament, or actually by demeaning the goddess by all these negative sexual metaphors of likening her to a prostitute, likening worshipping her to going and visiting a prostitute. And what Simon Magus has done, he's said, I'll take a prostitute and I will turn her into a goddess. I'm going to reverse that process. And this is how I will bring salvation to people. And it's this quite extraordinary sort of and very deliberate image. You know, he likens her to Sophia. He's used this great image of, he basically says, you know, the salvation of all of us, of humans, men and women, relies on acknowledging the sacred feminine, the importance of women, actually not just the goddess, the importance of women, of all women, you know, mortal women. So, you know, extraordinary figure. And of course, this is one of the reasons the early church condemns him for going around with an ex-prostitute. And there's a very sort of sexual element in this whole story. But you think, well, okay, he was very much like Jesus, except Jesus didn't go around with a woman. And then you know, who represents Sophia, who represents the goddess, and is essentially a priestess. Simon Magus goes around with one. Well, there's no similarity with Jesus, is there? And then you think, yes, there was a woman that went around with Jesus that the early church was very keen to cut out of their books. You think, that's it. You know, Mary Magdalene was to Jesus what Helen was to Simon Magus. And then you realise they're part of the same thing. Simon Magus is trying to reintroduce the goddess to the religion. He's a Samaritan, which is the same religion essentially, but they're also descended from Israelites. So you've also got this same agenda. And then the other extraordinary thing that, according to early Christian writings, that they have Simon Magus as being a disciple of John the Baptist. And suddenly, well, and who else started off as a disciple of John the Baptist? Yeah. And then suddenly this whole thing fits together. And the reason the early church is trying to write Simon Magus completely out of the story, and warn people against him, because there was a sect that worshipped Simon Magus that was still around for several centuries into the Christian era, that they're warning people away from this sect and away from Simon Magus and his teaching, is because he's too much like Jesus. Yeah. And of course, Jesus, in their thinking, has to be unique. Yeah. So again, this whole jigsaw falls into place.
Is it possible that Simon Magus and Jesus were at one point the same person, and the church kind of separated out the characteristics that they wanted?
I don't think so, because it's, you know, the story is very specific, you know. Okay. But they're working to the same plan. Yeah, I mean they're John the Baptist boys, aren't they? I mean that's where they began. Yeah, they were both in the same class essentially. You know. Now the same. You know, they went same plan, same agenda. I can see what you're saying. Could they be the same person? Because they're so much alike. You know, so the chronology is slightly wrong. Simon Magus is a contemporary of Jesus. They were alive at the same time, but he's doing his thing in Samaria, whereas Jesus is doing it in Judea. And you realise it's not just one mission. This is a movement. There's a whole movement. There's all sorts of people doing all kinds of things in different parts of, parts of that region. And I think it's just that, obviously, Jesus, an important figure. But as the religion got going, they had to make him unique. Yeah. And they had to change his story, remove the links with Simon Magus, remove the woman who gives the clue away. Yeah. But the thing about Simon Magus was that he was actually worshipped as a god. He was worshipped as a god in Rome. So that was something else, that they had in common. But he's been sort of swept under the carpet, and the bits that were the stories that everybody knew have been kind of demonized, which is more or less what happened with Mary Magdalene and with Helen.
So, it repays looking back at these stories with an objective eye and piecing it all together again, sort of, tearing it up and piecing it all back together again and seeing if it makes any more sense. And basically it does, as Clive said, in the light of, if you start with Simon Magus, as it were, and radiate out and see that how he was like Jesus, what his agenda was, his association with John the Baptist, and it just gets more and more interesting and less like what we've been told.
Right. And on the other side of Simon, you have Peter, who is as misogynistic as it gets. Yeah. And he's one of the people that really wanted to get women out of this completely.
It's another thing that comes across very clearly, because part of the problem when you're dealing with ancient texts, whether they be from the Gospels or or from some strange heretical Gnostic sect that put down their version of events, you're just dealing with what people wrote down. So there's no real way of checking it to what really happened. But one thing that comes across is there were essentially two separate sets of early sources about Peter. There's the Gnostic Gospels, which have a lot to do with Mary Magdalene, and there's another set of texts which have to do with Simon Magus. So from entirely separate sources, entirely different people, but they portray his character so much the same way. You have to start to think, yeah, this is what he was really like. Yeah. When independent sources, okay, you can't check them to the reality of the time, but when two independent sources are both portraying Peter from the point of view of somebody that hates women.
Yeah, even by the standards of the day, he hated women.
And then it becomes quite extraordinary. And then you actually think, Peter went on to, at least in legend and tradition, to found the Christian Church, the Catholic Church, which has not been entirely women-friendly, shall we say.
It still isn't.
Yeah. Lynn can talk more about the Gnostic Gospels and this battle between Peter and Mary Magdalene, than I can. But it's this great tension between these two figures, these two very important figures in Jesus' life, that almost kind of prefigure the next couple of thousand years of history.
Well, yeah.
Because you have a Magdalene sect, that continued as well, again underground. But then you've got Peter falling in the official religion, and the things that he says to her in the
Well, I mean, most people probably don't realise that there are more Gospels than the ones in the New Testament, and very largely, this is putting it very briefly and generally, but very largely. The others that we have in translation anyway are generally called the Gnostic Gospels, and they include the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, although it doesn't claim to have been written by her, by the way. But in these, they have basically one thing in common, and that is Mary Magdalene is the star. Now, as we've seen in the New Testament, she's hardly there, certainly by name, and she's a sort of also-ran. But in the Gnostic Gospels, she is absolutely there, this powerful, feisty woman who won't stop talking, who basically is the power behind the throne, let's be honest. She's the one who sort of stand behind Jesus and mutters in his ear, and they have their little secrets. On one occasion, for example, she says to him about some point of doctrine, and she says, why, Lord, why don't you tell the others, what we decided the other day? And you think, that's interesting. Is that the other thing that really, really comes across in the Gnostic Gospels, you cannot miss it, is the hatred that Peter has for her. And you have him going to Jesus and saying, Lord, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life.
Wow.
Yeah, a bit jaw-dropping. And on another occasion, she goes to Jesus and says, Lord, I am afraid of Peter because he hates me and all the race of women, and he has threatened me. In other words, he's threatened to kill her.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is huge. I mean, this as Clive said, kind of prefigures what happened to Christianity with the feminine side of it seeming to fall away, or officially falling away, and Peter's church taking over. So, but this is how it began. In this sort of interpersonal struggle within Jesus's group. And the other thing that becomes very clear from the Gnostic Gospels is it's not just Mary Magdalene that, although she is clearly Jesus's great beloved and priestess, but it's not just her that he gives space to and listens to. It's other women like Martha and a woman called Salome. He's a kind of proto-feminist, whereas the exact opposite to Peter. So right. You get all of this great tension and sort of seething background problems going on among the various people in Jesus's mission. And it's not going to end well.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned in here is that this story that we hear about the religion, it's the story written by the elites. It's not the story of the common people of the time. Just like today, really.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, things don't change. If you go all the way back to what we were saying earlier about you exaggerate, when you write your story, you exaggerate. These are all the same traits that come through, and it is when we read the books, say of the Old Testament, these are the books of the elite because they're the ones that could write. And another point we make in the book, that it became more and more apparent to us as we were doing the research, is that it's also it's particularly during the kingdoms of Israel. This is just the elite are only really concerned with themselves. So the people out in the fields, they don't. They're just not interested in how they worship. Asherah is very important to them. She's very important in the official cult, but it's the elite's only really interested in itself. But there come certain periods where suddenly there's this desire to come up with one truth, one official way of doing the religion, and to impose it on everybody, which isn't something that really happened in the ancient world. Different people believed different things and nobody really cared, particularly if they were peasants. But it's something you get very much when they create the religion, after the return from Babylon, where they decide on the texts, they decide on what the sacred book's going to be, they decide on what the history is going to be. And there's a very strong thing when you read those particular books, and we're going to make sure everybody believes this, or else everybody, you can't believe anything else, or you get out. And of course the same thing happens in Christianity. Is a church came along that said, we believe these certain things, and we're not going to tolerate anybody that believes anything else. It's this kind of top-down thing. And it happens twice in this story.
But at both times that you have, as it were, codifications of the, when you have the Old Testament codification of the religion, and when you have in the 4th century AD, you have the various committees and councils that basically come up with what would become standard Christianity for the Roman Empire, and both times casualties were the sacred feminine.
Yeah, and that's done so well for us. You also mentioned that the Virgin Mary is kind of an attempt to put the sacred feminine in there, but it's in a very weak way,
controllable way.
Yeah,
people need, have the great psychological need, spiritual need, for a goddess, for the sacred feminine. Men as much as women, and people are lost without it. And you can actually see a point in the 4th century where this yearning becomes so great that the church decides to, okay, you want a woman to worship, we'll give you one. Here she is, Jesus' mother, who wasn't terribly important for the first couple of 100 years of Christianity. And suddenly, they create this image. Okay, you've got someone that you can pray to now. She's kind of a goddess, but she's not particularly human.
Impossible standards. I mean, with with Asherah and Anat even, and the various pagan goddesses, they were complete females. A woman could go to those kind of goddesses with all their problems and problems of their love lives and their sins, if you like, and feel that they would be understood. Whereas you can't go to the Virgin Mary about somebody you want to have an affair with. You'd make her cry, apart from anything else. And you've always been, the great emphasis on the Virgin Mary is that she cries. She cries for your sins. She cries for the sins of the world. But she doesn't actually really understand the sins of the world, because she herself was so pure that she didn't actually give birth. It was some kind of peculiar miracle.
Right.
And she's the representative of impossible female standards. I mean, actually impossible. And it was very clever of the men to impose an impossible goddess, if you like, on the women fold in of the flock, because it was, as Clive said, a way of controlling them, of saying, you will never live up to this, you can never live up to this, you're just sinners, do as you're told.
Yeah. I have a couple other questions for you. Would you mind sticking around for a Patreon segment?
Oh no, go ahead. No,
please, yeah, please do.
Okay, so where can people find you online? I know you have a website. The book is available everywhere because it's on Inner Traditions, but you also have a website, right?
Yes, it's www.picknettprince.com. That's PicknettPrince, all one word, .com. And they can find out all about this book and other books in there, and what we've been up to, which hasn't been a hell of a lot lately because no one's been doing anything much lately.
No,
right.
But we've been doing actually quite a lot, including our own Patreon pages.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. And so we've put an awful lot of stuff up there, completely new and exclusive. So our website will tell you everything we've ever done, basically.
And we'll put links through to Patreon on there, because as Lynn was saying, we kind of use that to do sort of updates and things to our books and ongoing research and or expanded versions of things we just didn't have enough space for in some of our books. So we put a lot of material there.
Completely new material. Yeah.
But we've just not been doing much in the way of we do a lot of talks and lectures normally, but obviously that's all gone by the board at the moment. But it is giving us time to work on these other things and work on research. Except the libraries was closed for a long time. So yes, you can find out about us on our website and on Patreon.
I've also got my own Patreon page where I'm putting out my memoirs in 2 installments a month, called The Unchosen at number 15, about my life growing up in a haunted house in York, in the north of England, in the 1950s and 60s, and visions and various things that happened to me there, plus all sorts of other stuff, some of it quite funny. So that's my personal Patreon page.
Okay, awesome. I hope you enjoyed that. And Lynn and Clive stayed around for a little bit to talk to me on Patreon, and we had a more philosophical conversation about this stuff. So if you want to hear that, go to wheretheroadgo.com and click on the Patreon link. It's $3 a month, and you get a bunch of extra stuff. So that's it for this week. We'll see you next time.
You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can